What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Cape and Cowl podcast. This is episode 11. We are going to have this one be our normal seasonal data dump. I did complete my world's finest climb last week. The podcast episode just got a little bit delayed for whatever reason. But I have collected all of my aggregates to this point thus far in the season. So we've got a lot of cool stuff to talk about. Mainly, did things like the Batman nerf, make a tangible impact? How did the Aquaman nerf into buff make an impact on the overall meta? Are the new cards seeing play? And then on top of that, I think I need to start this conversation with one caveat being basically all of the games in my dataset happened before the most recent balance patch. So that was before the balance patch that nerfed Appetite, nerfed Robin, buffed Superboy. So the numbers in here might not necessarily be indicative of the current meta or the meta that is forming. This is basically before that point in time. So this data might already be a little bit outdated. But to be honest, as much as I think Appetite was nerfed, and I think it was a pretty heavy nerf, I still think Tyranny has enough good golds where I don't think Tyranny as a whole is going to see a ton less play. Maybe an initial drop as people overreact to the nerf. But I think people will come back very quickly once they realize Tyranny still has a lot of very strong cards and a lot of very strong, specifically golds. They were already kind of having an issue where they had so many good golds that you were cutting good cards just because you couldn't run all of them. So now, even if you just say, like, Appetite's unplayable, which, I disagree with. I think you just need to have a deck that supports Appetite. It's obviously nowhere near as strong as it was, but I don't think it's unplayable. But even if you say it's unplayable and you cut it, you still have things like Atlan, which I think is basically at Appetite's power level, if not a little bit weaker. It's up there. You still have your Darkseid, you still have your Brainiac, you still have so many strong golds that I think Tyranny is just fine in the long run. We may see an initial dip, but I don't think it's going to be a permanent dip. So, let's talk about the climb. My spreadsheet with data is at about 100 tracked games so far. But my climb to World's Finest took me, I believe, around 85 games, maybe a little bit less, but it was around roughly 85 games. And that was almost entirely, I think entirely actually, with my Harley Wonder Woman aggro list. It was almost the same exact list that I've played the last two seasons, but I did put some new cards into it. Mainly, we ran a copy of Chimera because that card can just high roll and win games if it doesn't get answered on turn one, and aggro decks like to high roll. And we also cut Wildcat in favor of Volko. I think losing that one attack from Wildcat in exchange for a board-wide buff is incredibly strong, especially with some of those power turns that I've been accustomed to setting up, like send in the Clown's Hippolyta. Now you can send in the Clown's Volko on turn 2 instead of needing to wait for turn 3 for Hippolyta, or just in general, pushing the power of your board. I still think that deck is incredibly underrated by most people. I think, for whatever reason, I don't think it's the most, exciting deck for sure. But I think it's a very strong deck. It's a very good aggro deck. It climbs quickly. And I think it matches up with a lot of the most played stuff. So I don't know why it doesn't get played more, but that's besides the point. So, like I said, about 85 games with Harley Wonder Woman. The overall win rate for the deck was 73% on the season. And that actually represented a little bit of a dip. Most of the season I was averaging actually 78%, and we had a bit of a dip towards the end of the climb. I went on a couple loss streaks. Just some not unfortunate, like I wouldn't call them high rolls by my opponent, but just like unfortunate things for the deck. Like this deck flat out loses to Appetite at any point, old Appetite. So like I had a 10th metal Appetite on turn 3, that's a loss. Any silver 1 culling, often, almost all the time, I think all the time is a loss. So like when things like that happen, that's typically a loss for this deck. And in other things like when your Aquaman opponent has a silver 1 Mera, they activate Aquaman and they hit I think it's like a 55-60% chance to get the sea creature to proc Mera. That kind of 55-ish% chance when they play it and they hit, that's typically very hard for this deck to come back against. So it needs to be, I can't call them high rolls because they're not necessarily high rolls, but like those unfortunate, like they have the card they need scenarios happened a bunch of games in a row and kind of dropped my win rate, which, I mean, you can call it regressing to the average. Still, 73% is incredibly high. That includes an 83% win rate on the play and a 75% win rate on the draw. So my play and draw win rates were about 7% apart. And even that kind of normalized a bit. Most of the season, my play win rate was 90%, and my draw win rate was like 65, 70. So my play win rate had dropped about 5%, and my draw win rate went up about 5%. So now they're really only, about 8% apart, which I don't think is too bad, especially for an aggro deck. An aggro deck's always going to want to go first. So I think that's a very reasonable spread. As far as specific opponents go, I did track. So we'll talk about, the top 5 leaders in general, or like the leader frequencies and all the other combinations that we usually talk about. But in order, my top 5 most seen leaders were Aquaman, Ivy, Batman, Black Adam, and Batgirl. And against those specific opponents, this deck had a win rate of 65.4% against Aquaman. So less than the deck's overall win rate, but still a very strong win rate against Aquaman in general. A 65% flat win rate against Ivy. This was the lowest percent win rate against the top 5 leaders. Against Batman, it had a 77.27% win rate. And I think this kind of, I don't want to say confirms, but it supports my initial theory of the Batman nerf really not nerfing him in general, but making him a bit worse against aggro. I think that number shows. Against Black Adam, which I saw a good amount of times, I saw Black Adam 13 times total. We had a 100% win rate against Black Adam. Never lost a single game against him. And then finally, rounding out the top 5 was Batgirl, and we had a 66.67% win rate against Batgirl. So, pretty strong win rates against the 5 most popular leaders. Especially that 100% against Black Adam's pretty sick. Okay, so now the rest of our combinations total, this is not specifically my ladder climb. I have collected some games post World's Finest, so we've got about 100 games ranked on this spreadsheet right now. So about 15 additional games outside of the climb. And the most seen factions in order is we have Tactics at a 52.58% win rate. And I believe that is actually an increase from last season. So I'm going to open up the spreadsheet just to confirm. I want to double check last season. But I believe Tactics has actually gone up. It has. Last season, my Tactics rate was 45.52%. So Tactics has gone up 7% total. In terms of Batman's nerf, last season I saw Batman at a 34.33% rate, and this season it is a 26.8% chance. Now, I want to caveat that with, initially at the start of the season, Batman was almost nowhere to be seen, and I think that was people overreacting to his nerf. As the season's gone on, Batman has been seen more and more, so I am fairly confident that if I keep tracking high numbers of games, the Batman play rate is only going to grow. I would not be surprised if he's back above 30% before too long. So, Tactics, 52.58% total. Batman, 26.8%, or 26 total games. We have Batgirl at 16%, or 16.5% at 16 games. Green Arrow at 5 games, or 5.15%. And Cyborg at 4.12%, or only 4 games. So, very top-heavy still for Tactics. Batgirl seeing a pretty healthy surge in popularity, which I think is to be expected. We saw a good amount of experimentation. She was already had a niche with Joker, and I think this season we saw her pop up a bit more with Aquaman, and I think people are just experimenting with Batgirl even more in a kind of toned-down Batman world, but also Batman's still very strong, and I think his play rate is only going to continue to rise from there. So after Tactics, we have Tyranny coming in at second place in play rate at a 42.27% total. And Tyranny kind of tells the same picture as Tactics, with a top-heavy and then next to no representation in the bottom half. So we had Poison Ivy at a 21.65%, 21 total games. And that represented a slight dip for her. Most of the season, she was averaging, I think, 28-ish%, 25 to 28. So she's dropped a little bit, but still is the third most popular leader in the game, behind Batman and Aquaman for me. I might have actually flopped those numbers around in my top fives. So yeah, it was Aquaman, Batman, Ivy, Batgirl, Black Adam, in order, 1 to 5. So, Poison Ivy, first most popular Tyranny leader. More than half of the total Tyranny representation was Poison Ivy. Tyranny had 41 total games. Ivy was 21 of them. Then we had Black Adam at 13%. I still don't think Black Adam is good, but I think the uptick in Black Adam rate was to be expected this season. Aquaman got kind of buffed, so Aquaman already kind of paired nicely with Black Adam. And Black Adam got a couple new very interesting tools this season, like the Dead King Scepter, like Atlan, like that 5/7 with Aura that gets +2/+2 when a card with 5 power dies. Even Siren is Black Adam support. So I expected to see more Black Adam. I still think he needs a little bit more love or just a slower meta. Like I said, the aggro deck kind of just ran him over. Then third place in Tyranny, we had Lex Luthor with 5 games or a 5.15% win rate. And this was one of the pieces of data that surprised me the most. Last place in Tyranny was General Zod, only 2 games or 2.06% play rate. I was expecting to see more Zod. I think Zod is solid. I don't know why we didn't see more Zod, but that is what it is. Third place, and this is the most unevenly distributed game, we had Might at 40.21%, 39 total games of Might. However, out of those 39 games of Might, Aquaman was 33 of them. So Aquaman was representing, over 90% of Might's play. Aquaman had a total 34.02% play rate. He's basically hit old Batman levels of play rate. And if you look at the top 3 of this season, Aquaman at 34%, Batman at 27%, and Ivy at just shy of 22%. Last season, the top 3 was Batman at 34%, Aqua at 22%, and Ivy at 19%. So what that means is your top 3 stayed exactly the same. Aqua and Batman just switched spots. But on top of that, due to things like the nerf to Flash Doomsday hitting that harder than the other things, the top 3 from last season to this season actually has grown in play rate. Now, maybe Ivy drops a little bit post-Appetite nerf, but the top 3 leaders that you would have expected last balance patch to target, they collected a net increase in play rate from last season to this season. Your top leader is about the same. Batman used to be 34.3%. This season, Aquaman was 34.02%. So we'll call that basically a wash. Second place last season was 22.4%. This season, it's just shy of 27%. So we've got a 5% increase there. And then third place last season was Ivy at 19.4%. And this season, Ivy is at 21.65%. So your top 3 leaders are only increasing in play rate. I don't think that is ideal. It's been the same 3 leaders we're going on, over 5 months now. I appreciate what the balance patches are trying to do, and maybe the Appetite and Robin nerfs can really push this forward further. So I'm gonna say this isn't a definitive statement. We need to see how the meta shakes out after these most recent balance changes. But if those balance changes don't make a significant impact in this, I think they will need to take more drastic action, because the top 3 are staying the top 3 and they're only growing more popular, which is not ideal. But beyond Aquaman at 33 games and 34%, we had both Wonder Woman and Superman at 3 games each, or a 3.09% play rate. So very little for the rest of Might as a whole. For fourth place, we've got Energy at 37 games total, or a 38.14% play rate. The number 1 leader in Energy was Shazam at 13 games, or 13.4%. Second place, we had Zatanna at 11 games, or 11.34%. Flash at 8 games, or 8.25%. Hal at 5 games, or 5.15%. Season in and season out, Energy continues to be the best distributed leaders. I know everybody has a lot of hate towards Shazam and Energy as a whole, but Energy continuously has the best distribution of leaders across the board. And I think that's a good sign that if people think Shazam's too good, but Energy is very well distributed amongst their leaders, I think it shows that Energy is probably in a good place overall. And then finally, we have Anarchy, who again is usually pretty good with their distribution, but Anarchy had the lowest play rate by far on the season. 26 games total, or only 26.8% of games. That means the distance between 5th place and 4th place for the factions was spread by almost 12 percentage points total, which is pretty crazy. The number one leader for for Anarchy was Joker at 10 games, or 10.31%. Then we had a 3-way tie for Black Manta, Doomsday, and Harley at 5 games each, or 5.15%. I do want to caveat the Black Manta games by saying all 5 of these were like the first couple hours of the season rollover. I think people were experimenting with the new leader and the new cards. After those first couple hours, I did not see Black Manta a single time. So take with that what you will. It might be a good thing that Mill isn't too good, though. And then finally, we had Batman Who Laughs with only 1 game played, making Batman Who Laughs and General Zod the 2 least played leaders on the season, and that makes Batman Who Laughs 2 seasons in a row of the least played leader in the game. And things like Green Arrow, Hal, Wonder Woman, Superman, they're all kind of staying firmly planted in the bottom. So that is what it is there for play rates and all that jazz. The most commonly seen leader combinations, in case you're curious about that. The most commonly seen leader combination for me on the season was Batman Ivy. At 9 games, or 9.28% of my total matchups were Batman Ivy. I think that makes sense. Bat Ivy's always been one of the best decks. We'll see how that fares post-Appetite nerf. But that has been my most commonly seen leader combination. Second place was Aqua Atom at 8 games, or 8.25%. Again, I think that was mostly experimentation. I don't expect that to stick. Third place was Batgirl Joker at 6 games, or 6.19%. Batgirl Joker has always been kind of like I don't even want to call it a tier 2 deck, because when it hits, its power level is very high. But popularity-wise, we'll say it was a tier 2 deck. And it's always been higher in percentage seen, because those 2 leaders just kind of love being together, so you don't see a lot of swapping out necessarily. I know Hal and Joker seeing some popularity recently, but in general, it's been Batgirl Joker, and you don't see a lot of one without the other. Then we had Batman Black Adam at 5 total games. I'm not sure what that was. Maybe the Beatles trying to charge Adam. But again, I chalk that up to Black Adam experimentation. Don't expect to see a lot of that. And then rounding out the most popular combinations were 3 tied at 4 games each. Shazbat, Flash Doomsday, and Aquaman Batgirl. I think, most of this is fairly reasonable. Aquaman Batgirl basically is what would have been Aquabat last season. Shazbat's always been in the top 3 to 5. Bat Ivy's always been top 3. Aqua Atom, I think, is a flash in the pan of experimentation. Basically, most of the top decks in this most commonly seen combinations are fairly, static to what we've seen in season past. We've seen Aquabat get replaced by Aquabat Girl. Basically same thing. But at least it's a little bit different take on that. So as a whole, what do I think? I wish I had more data in a post Appetite nerf world, personally. I would like to see if that has a real impact on things. I think things like the Superboy buff could have a pretty big impact on the game overall, although I think that just kind of winds up being Aquaman buffs as well. Until Aquaman is weaker, any buff to Might is specifically going to help Aquaman the most, although it does help all 3. I think we still need to look at the top 3 leaders. If Ivy and Tyranny as a whole is still high post-Appetite nerf, which I think it will be, because, like I said, I think Atlan is a Appetite level of power. I think we're going to need something a little bit more aggressive soon to force a shakeup of these top 3 leaders. Aquaman is basically now into Batman levels of popularity. Batman is still one of the most popular leaders now, with Batgirl climbing the ranks with him. So now we're going to have basically two very similar game plans. Whether you want the Batgirl flavor or Batman flavor, you're still going to be playing the same decks, but at least Batgirl is different, so I'm going to give them points there. But the kind of over-prevalence of what we call the sacred holy trinity of Dual Force, being Batman, Aquaman, and Ivy, I think we need to find a way to break their reign at some point very soon. I think we need to explore some more buffs to Batman Who Laughs. I don't think the Rabbit Robin 1 health buff helped him all that much. I think he's just very slow. He probably deserves to have some attack on his ability. Yeah, and I think we just want to see... I would like to see the whole game hit Energy's levels of distribution. So the least played Energy leader had 5 games. The most played had 13. So that is an 8-game spread between bottom and top. Whereas, you have things like Tactics, where bottom and top are 22 games apart. Almost 7 times more games between bottom and top. Whereas in Energy, it's less than 3. In Might, it's 30 games apart, or 11 times spread. Anarchy, it is 9 spread, which is closer. But if you remove Batman Who Laughs as being bad, Anarchy is pretty well balanced as well, besides being not seen enough as a whole. When you see Anarchy, I think the spread for them is pretty solid. And then same thing with Tyranny. Ivy is more than 10 times most seen, the least seen leader. Or even if you remove Zod and you say Lex, Ivy is still over 4 times. So I think the general goal should be to approach levels of distribution that Energy and Anarchy have. I think those are 2 of the most balanced overall factions. Even if cards inside of them are very strong, I think the leader balance amongst those factions should be what we are aiming for as a whole in the game. So yeah, that is my Season 4 Climb data. I will continue to be collecting data throughout the rest of the season to see how the meta changes over time, and I will try and aggregate my data with other creators as the season goes on, and maybe do another episode of like the total combined data edition or something like that. But yeah, thank you all so much for listening. If you guys have any suggestions for topics for future podcasts, drop them down below, either on the Spotify question and answer section or the YouTube comments section. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you guys next time.